so the diencephalon is divided into these three areas, and you can see that they kind of revolve around the thalamus. So epi means above, this is the area above the thalamus, and hypo is below the thalamus. Okay, so I think we're gonna start with the epithalamus here. And the epithalamus, just so you know, actually just involves two things. This includes the roof of the third ventricle and a little gland called the pineal gland, and that's it. Okay, so we'll talk about this, but this probably sounds kind of weird, but remember that the third ventricle is in the midline, right in the diencephalon. So this area being kind of the top part of the diencephalon, it just includes the roof, like the top of the ventricle, okay? Okay, so let's take a look here. Okay, so this diagram is showing the diencephalon, and someone pointed out to me that actually they have kind of a dotted line in your book, and this might be in the newest edition, I'm not sure if it's in all of the editions, but a dotted line that goes around this whole area here. It actually is a little bit odd because it includes the corpus callosum and the septum pellucidum. These are really up in the cerebrum, okay? So the diencephalon really is right here. It kind of has a strange shape. It's like that, okay? Most of it is the thalamus, which is this kind of oval-shaped structure here. And so this, again, like right above the thalamus, it just includes the roof of the third ventricle, and this little gland, the pineal gland, that is the epithalamus, and this area here is the hypothalamus, okay? Notice that this red structure is actually part of the third ventricle. What is that? This is the choroid plexus. So you guys remember that each ventricle has a choroid plexus. What does the choroid plexus do? It makes cerebrospinal fluid, yes. So remember, it's blood vessels and the ependymal cells that cover the blood vessels. So that's why it looks like it's red, because it's blood vessels. Okay, so let's talk about that pineal gland. This is a tiny little gland. You guys are gonna look at the sheep brain today. When you get your sheep brain, it's going to already be cut, okay? So it's just gonna have a mid-sagittal cut. Because this gland is so tiny, sometimes it's cut in half really well, but sometimes you'll see it on one side or the other. And because it's small, sometimes it just gets like pulled off and you might not see it at all on your brain. So you wanna just look at a different one if you can't find the pineal gland. Okay, so what does the pineal gland do? This is an interesting gland because it controls things that revolve on a kind of 24-hour cycle, like mainly that would be our sleep-wake cycle, right? It controls the sleep-wake cycle. It secretes a hormone that is called melatonin. You guys know that hormones are released into the blood. And so what does this hormone do? It has to do with our sleep-wake cycle. Well, this is actually a hormone that makes us sleepy. This is why it's difficult for people to get used to trying to sleep during the day and then work at night. It's very difficult to do that because we're really designed to sleep at night. When it's dark out, this hormone increases in the blood and it makes us sleepy. So you can buy this as a supplement. You guys have probably heard of melatonin. You can buy it where they sell different supplements, and it makes you sleepy. It helps with sleeping. So some people take this as a sleep aid. This gland and its hormone that it secretes, melatonin, kind of interacts with our sex hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland. So there are certain hormones in both males and females that are, when they're released, they will affect the ovaries and testes. And so because melatonin interacts with those hormones, it also has kind of an effect on things like puberty. It will influence the onset of puberty, and it also has an effect on the menstrual cycle in females. But this is its primary effect, helps to regulate the sleep-wake or day-night cycle. Okay, any questions? Okay, so let's talk about the thalamus. This is that big area that's kind of in the middle of the diencephalon, you can think of this as being the sensory relay station. This is just an easy way to remember what it does. I think that's a good nickname to remember because that's really what the thalamus does. It receives all of the incoming sensory information when it goes to the brain. The first place it's going to go is the thalamus. Now, we talked about the sensory cortex, so you might be thinking, well, hey, she told us it goes to the cortex, but it goes here first. So the thalamus is kind of like the secretary in a way. It's going to decide what goes on to the corporate office. It's going to weed out any information that doesn't seem important. So it decides what's important at the time based on how much of that information is coming in. And it will kind of sort it all out, and it sends it up to the appropriate part of the cortex. You guys remember we have all these different sensory areas depending on what type of sensory information it is. So it sends it to the right area of the cortex. Okay, so notice that the one type of sensory information it does not receive is smell. Smell is different. It goes directly back to its own cortex. It does not go to the thalamus first. Okay, and another structure that's on your list is that little piece of tissue that connects the two sides of the thalamus. So again, remember that the third ventricle is in this area. It's in the diencephalon, and it's kind of right in the midline. So remember the third ventricle, if you look at the model, it looks like it has a little hole in it. And what goes through there is this piece of tissue. The thalamus has two lobes. It has a right and a left lobe, and they're connected in the middle by that little piece of tissue called the interthalamic adhesion, or you can say intermediate mass. Either one is fine, okay? Either one is perfectly fine. So that goes right through the third ventricle. Okay, so that is the thalamus. Now let's take a look at this next diagram. This shows a more detailed look at the thalamus. You do not have to know all these individual nuclei, okay? You do not have to know all of those. Just know the whole thing is the thalamus. You guys may talk about some of these when you take physiology. And there's the little intermediate mass or interthalamic adhesion that connects the two sides. Any questions on that? Okay, and then the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is another really interesting part of the brain, is right below the thalamus. This is a really important area for controlling everything that we can't control consciously. Things like our body temperature, our metabolism, how fast our cells make, ATP, how fast they use up energy to make ATP, growth. So many things are controlled by the hypothalamus. Why is that? Well, because two things that the hypothalamus is kind of the boss of. It controls the pituitary gland, and you may know the pituitary gland is called the master gland because it secretes so many hormones. So the pituitary controls a lot of our other endocrine glands in the body. And it is controlled by the hypothalamus. Also, the hypothalamus controls our autonomic nervous system. This is kind of the higher center in the brain that controls, our fight or flight reaction, as well as the rest and digest part of the nervous system. So we'll talk about the autonomic nervous system next time, I think on Wednesday. Got a lot of stuff to talk about. Okay, so let's take a look. Actually, we'll take a look in just a minute. This is a little bit more of a detailed list of things controlled by the hypothalamus, and again, this is actually just a partial list. So it controls so many autonomic functions. Also, some emotions, as well as sex drive, are controlled by the hypothalamus. Sensations of thirst and hunger. This is where our satiety center is, that gives you that feeling of fullness. Again, growth, metabolism, water and electrolyte balance, urine production, all those things are controlled here. So really important part of the brain. Of course, everything is important, but this is an area that's really important for all of our autonomic functions. Okay, so taking a look at this area, this is again a more detailed view of the hypothalamus. You do not have to know all of these different nuclei, okay? Just know this whole area here is called the hypothalamus. One thing I do want you to know though, notice that the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary through this little little attachment, little piece of tissue here. This is called the infundibulum, long word for a little tiny piece of tissue. Okay, infundibulum. So through that connection, the hypothalamus actually controls the pituitary gland. And then the pituitary in turn controls other glands in the body. Okay? And looking back at this diagram one more time, this is the thalamus we were just talking about. That is the intermediate mass, or interthalamic adhesion. Okay? You guys have any questions on any of that? Okay, so let's go down into the next part of the brain. And remember, all of these three areas below the diencephalon together make up the brain stem. All of those together are called the brain stem. But it's really these three regions, the midbrain, or you can say mesencephalon, the pons, and the medulla. So we're going to start with the midbrain. We're just going to keep working our way down. Okay. Okay, so this is a diagram of the brain stem. This is an anterior view, and this is kind of turned like it's, actually it says here a posterolateral view, kind of at an angle. Now notice that in this diagram, if you look closely, you can see this area right here is what they're labeling as the midbrain. Okay, it's just this right here. Okay, this anterior bulge is the pons. So the pons would be right here. And then this area below that, just that, is the medulla. Okay, about like that. So they're including part of the spinal cord here. Remember that when this travels through the foramen magnum, that is the boundary between the medulla and the spinal cord, okay? So they're including part of the spinal cord in each of these diagrams. And also notice that they're kind of leaving the diencephalon on top in these diagrams. So again, this is the midbrain, okay? So this is the thalamus up here. They're just kind of sticking it on top of the brain stem. Notice that, I just want to point this out to you, so when you guys look at these models, you're not confused with this. Notice that these two models of the brainstem look just like this. Well, they look like it at first, but if you look closely, they are actually a little different, okay? So notice on this model that this thing here is actually, it's part of the cerebrum stuck on top of the diencephalon. So although this looks like this, it is a little different, okay? So these things here are actually supposed to be those nuclei that we talked about that are deep inside the cerebrum. These are the basal nuclei, okay? I wouldn't ask you to identify them on this because I like to show you the frontal section where you can see them better, okay? But that's what this is. This is actually the tract that crosses over the midline that connects the right and left sides. So what would that be? The corpus callosum, right? That is the corpus callosum. Okay, these axons that are radiating out toward the cortex would be, up to the cortex, corona radiata. You can see all of that stuff also on this model. Okay, this goes with those big brain models. Basal nuclei, corona radiata. It actually doesn't show the corpus callosum here. Okay, but these are, again, basal nuclei. So these are a little different than the diagram. I just didn't want you to get confused with that. Down here would be the thalamus, okay, this area here. Same with this model, okay, the thalamus is actually down here. This would be the third ventricle, that's the pineal gland. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the midbrain first. We're gonna start with these 4 little bumps right here, okay? The 4 little bumps on the posterior side. Together, these are called the corpora quadrigemina because there are 4 of them, okay? Quad meaning 4, and corpora means bodies. So this name tells you there are 4 of these little kind of bulges. This is also referred to as the tectal plate. Okay, tectal plate. The whole area can also be called the tectal plate. I don't care which name you use, okay? This consists of these 2 superior little bumps. They are called the superior colliculi and the 2 inferior colliculi below them. Okay, so what do these do? The superior colliculi is where we have visual reflexes, right? So you see something that's coming at you suddenly and you have to get out of the way. We saw that a lot in the game where sometimes I think the batters are actually kind of exaggerating it a little bit, but sometimes they're afraid they're gonna get hit with the ball. So that's a good example of this area giving you a quick reaction time. So this is a little bit of a quicker reaction than, having to have all those other parts of the brain respond to something that you're seeing. Like when your visual cortex sends the information to the visual association area, and then from there we have to have a connection to the motor cortex, right, so that we have a response. This is a little faster because what happens here is some axons from the optic nerve go directly to this area, the superior colliculi. So they don't go to the thalamus with all of the rest of the optic nerve, they go here. They synapse directly on motor neurons that turn the head and turn the eyes so that we see what's coming at us and you can respond more quickly. So it's a really interesting area. And so we'll just say that the function here is visual reflexes.
What determines what's important enough to be responded to this then?
I think anything that's moving is something we're gonna respond to. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this area picks up movement. Like, this is really well developed in cats because they are predators. They see something moving and they're on it. Have you ever noticed if you've ever seen a cat, if they see movement, they're just like fixated. And so it's not necessarily to protect us always. It's, in that case, it's actually, for survival. So it's just an area that allows us to respond quickly. Good when we're driving, right? Something is, moving toward us and we want to be able to respond quickly. So any movement is usually going to cause this area to, we turn and look. Okay, so inferior colliculi, same idea, but this is more for auditory reflexes. So some of the axons from the 8th cranial nerve carrying sound will go here to the inferior colliculi and synapse on motor neurons, again, that turn the head and turn the eyes so that we look toward, a sudden noise that we might have to respond to in order to protect ourselves or, respond just to whatever it happens to be, that we're hearing sudden noises. Okay? Okay, so taking a look now, something else you can see here in these diagrams, notice on the anterior side, you see what looks like kind of these striated structures, kind of like striated columns is what these look like. These are referred to as the cerebral peduncles. Okay, cerebral peduncles. I know peduncle is a very strange word. This actually means little foot. That's what it literally means, little foot. But this is another word for tract. You guys know tracts are groups of axons traveling together, right? So if you think about it, it makes sense that we're going to have a lot of axons traveling through the entire brainstem because we have to connect the brain to the spinal cord, right? What type of tracts are these based on the direction they're traveling? Projection, yes. So this is projection tracts in the midbrain. Okay, they're referred to as the cerebral peduncles. And notice they're on the anterior aspect, where the corpora quadrigemina are posterior. Okay, so now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a look at a cross-section through this area, okay, a cut that goes through this way. Can't see the midbrain here, but it would go through that way. And we're gonna look at a couple nuclei that are deep inside the midbrain. Any questions on this before we go on? Okay, so these are the two nuclei we're going to talk about now, the red nuclei and the substantia nigra. These are both really easy to identify because they both kind of stand out, and they are inside. Notice they both have to do with helping us control movement, skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, so you guys remember that where we actually plan and initiate movement has to be in the cortex, right? Because that's where we think, and that's where, you know, you're gonna decide how and when you're going to move. But there's so many areas in the brain that help to coordinate movement, help to kind of fine tune it, make it look more smooth and kind of efficient. And these are both areas that will help to coordinate movement. Okay, so taking a look here at this cross-section, notice how this goes through the midbrain this way. This diagram will be on the test, okay? So first of all, you want to remember this is a cut through the midbrain. And these are the superior colliculi that we just talked about. So that's where that's the level of the cut. Notice this little canal here is the cerebral aqueduct. We said that travels through the midbrain, right? So it goes right through here. What does the cerebral aqueduct connect?
The third and fourth ventricle.
The third and fourth ventricles, yes. So this contains cerebrospinal fluid and connects the third and fourth ventricles. Okay, so the two nuclei we're talking about are right here. Notice the red nuclei, they're shown in red. These supposedly have a really good blood supply, so they do appear more reddish. And again, this is a group of neurons. Remember, a nucleus is just a collection of neuron cell bodies. These neurons help to control certain movements of the upper extremities, but just know that they're important for motor coordination. Okay, motor coordination. Red nuclei. Okay, and right next to the red nuclei, we have this kind of strip of dark tissue. This is called the substantia nigra, which means black substance. These nuclei supposedly have a lot of iron in their cell bodies, which make them look dark. It makes, you know, they pick up stain, it makes this area look dark. You've probably all heard of the substantia nigra. Maybe you didn't realize that they were talking about the substantia nigra, but we hear about this area a lot when we hear about Parkinson's disease. This is the area that's involved with Parkinson's. I'm sure you guys have all seen people who have Parkinson's. You all know that as far as processing, you know, information, they're normal. They can think and know what they want to say and respond to, you know, their mentally, their cognitive function is normal. Their sensory function is normal, but what's affected is motor, right? They have a difficult time moving, they have a difficult time controlling facial expression, they usually have a tremor where they shake, and they have a difficult time kind of starting and stopping movements because this area is involved with coordinating muscle contraction. So the neurons here, in this substantia nigra, they secrete a neurotransmitter called dopamine, and you may have heard of dopamine. So when they are not secreting a normal amount of dopamine, that is what results in Parkinson's disease, or that's what causes those Parkinson's-like symptoms. So in Parkinson's, these neurons start to degenerate and are not secreting a normal level of dopamine, and it will affect movement. Okay, and then on the anterior side, this is anterior, these would be the cerebral peduncles, where the axons are passing through. Okay, so that is the midbrain. As we go through these sections, anything that's labeled that we are not talking about, you don't have to identify. We actually are going to talk about the reticular formation, but I'm not going to ask you to identify it in all of these diagrams. So anything that's, we're not talking about, you don't have to worry about labeling. But this diagram will be on the test. Okay, so be able to just identify the parts that we've talked about. Do you guys have any questions before we go on? Okay, so the next area is called the pons. The pons is that kind of big anterior bulge. And just two things I would like you to know about the pons. Again, projection tracts are going to be traveling through here, connecting different areas. One of the tracts is called the middle cerebellar. Notice this is not cerebral, cerebellar peduncle. If you look at a diagram, you'll see that the cerebellum is right behind the pons. This is a tract that connects the cerebellum to the cerebral motor cortex. Okay, and we'll come back to that later. We'll talk about what these neurons do. It just happens to travel through the pons, kind of passes through the pons on its way to the cerebellum. Also in the pons, there is a respiratory center. It's just called a respiratory center. You will probably talk about this when you take physiology. This is an area that helps to control the rate and rhythm of respiration, and it works together with a respiratory center in the medulla. Okay, so the pons and the medulla are the areas that control respiration. Important areas, of course. If these areas are damaged, you cannot breathe on your own. Even if everything else is working normally. Your lungs might be fine, the diaphragm might be perfectly fine, but if these areas don't control the diaphragm, then it's not going to contract. Okay. Okay, so let's go down into the medulla, and this is a diagram showing the pons. It's kind of got that big anterior bulge that sticks out here. And notice, you can see how the middle cerebellar peduncles kind of make it look wide here laterally. Okay, so we'll come back to those. This is the fourth ventricle, which is located just behind the pons and the medulla. And then this would be the cerebellum. Okay, so the medulla is a really important area just for keeping us alive. If this area is damaged, it's usually fatal. This is an area that controls autonomic reflexes. So again, we're sensory neurons synapse directly on motor neurons that go out to our blood vessel walls, the heart, the diaphragm, again, helps to control respiration. And then we have other reflexes located here. So the cardiovascular center, notice it tells you it has something to do with the heart and also blood vessels. So this is going to control heart rate, okay, which is abbreviated HR, and blood pressure, BP. Okay, and then again, the respiratory center controls the rate and rhythm of respiration along with the pons. Okay, and other reflexes would be things that empty body cavities whenever we have an irritation, like sneezing, coughing, vomiting, and also swallowing. Okay, let's take a look at the medulla, and we'll see two other structures here that I would like you to know. As far as these different nuclei that control these reflexes, you do not have to identify them, okay? I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so let's talk about these structures when we see this next diagram here. Okay, so notice here, this is pointing out like the respiratory center, I think, yeah, the cardiac center. It's one of those phantom views, like you're looking through the tissue and you can kind of see where those nuclei would be located, but this diagram will not be on the test. Okay, this one I may include on the practical, and you can see here these two kind of little anterior bulges. They kind of stick out a little bit on the anterior side. These are called the pyramids, okay? The pyramids are actually projection tracts. So again, this is where we have axons passing through that are traveling vertically. Okay, so projection tracts in the medulla. And just lateral to the pyramids, we have this other kind of little bulge right here, a little bit more lateral. Okay, so right here, these are called the olives. Okay, just like, you know, the kind you eat, except you probably wouldn't want to eat these, but I mean, the name is the same. Okay, these are the olives. And sometimes they're even shown in like an olive green on the models. Notice inside the olive, there's this kind of squiggly looking group of neuron cell bodies. This is called the inferior olivary nucleus. Okay, the inferior olivary nucleus. So the nucleus is inside the little bulge that's called the olive. Okay, so inferior olivary nucleus. This nucleus is where there are neurons that will carry a certain type of sensory information called proprioception that will eventually go to the cerebellum. Okay, so let me just say these neurons carry proprioception. Proprioception is body awareness, knowing how the body is positioned because you can feel it. You don't have to look to see where your feet are because you can feel them, and that is proprioception. These sensory receptors that carry this type of information are located in our joints and our muscles. So that makes sense because kind of the joint position, you know, tells us how we're, you know, standing or sitting, lying, whatever it happens to be. So this information goes to different parts of the brain to help us coordinate movement. Okay, so that is the medulla. Alrighty, so we're gonna talk about the cerebellum and then just a couple of other quick things, and then we're done with the brain. Yay! Do you guys have any questions on this? Again, you can see the fourth ventricle here. Notice in a lot of these diagrams, we see different cranial nerves where the nerve is exiting from these different parts of the brainstem. You don't have to identify these in all these diagrams, just so you know. Okay. Okay, so the cerebellum actually looks kind of like a miniature cerebrum. Actually, that is what the name means. It means little brain. And this is not part of the brainstem. It sits behind the brainstem. So notice here in the superior view, you can see it has two hemispheres, just like the cerebrum. They are connected in the center by this little strip of tissue that is called the vermis. Vermis means it's worm-shaped. Okay, that's what the name means, worm-shaped. Okay, and the hemispheres have lobes. You do not have to know the names of the lobes, but very similar in the way it's organized to the cerebrum. Also, just like the cerebrum, notice the cerebellum has its own cortex. This is where most of the neuron cell bodies in the cerebellum would be located. All this gray matter here is called the cortex. To increase surface area of the cortex, there are these little folds. But these are not called gyri like in the cerebrum. These are called folia, like the foliage of a tree. Okay, so these little folds are the folia. And you can see here the white matter branches out, kind of does look like a tree. This is called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. Okay, the white matter is the arbor vitae. Okay, so what does the cerebellum do? This is the most important part of the brain for helping to coordinate skeletal muscle contraction. Okay, so motor coordination coordinates all different kinds of movements, very fine, precise movements, as well as, big movements that, require the whole body. Also, very important area for balance. So when people are intoxicated, when they do sobriety tests, they're actually testing the cerebellum, right? They have people try to, touch their fingertip to their nose, walk, a straight line. So as you can imagine, not that any of us have ever been under the influence, right? But very difficult to do those things because alcohol really affects the cerebellum. So this is an easy way to see, it will show if you've had too much because motor coordination is really affected, and so is balance. People who have damage to their cerebellum actually look like they might be drunk or under the influence, and they can't control movement well. They can still move, they can initiate movement because that's done by the motor cortex, but it won't look normal. And little things that we take for granted, like just tapping a certain rhythm, they can't do things like that. So it's interesting because it affects movement in a lot of ways. So how does the cerebellum help to coordinate our movement? Well, I'm so glad you asked, because I want to tell you. Okay, so we talked about how there's a middle cerebellar peduncle that goes through the pons. Well, actually there are 3 cerebellar peduncles, and we will take a look at what they do. This is actually a diagram that's in chapter 17. Okay, chapter 17 is called Pathways. It explains how things are connected. You do not really have to read anything except if you want to read this. This explains how these peduncles work, but I'm going to explain that to you right now. So notice this just shows these 3 connections where axons are traveling in and out of the cerebellum. These are the 3 cerebellar peduncles. You guys remember peduncle means tract, okay? So we know that the cerebellum helps to coordinate our movement, but how does it do that? Well, it has to receive the planned movement from the cortex, so it knows what we're trying to do, and then it receives that sensory feedback called proprioception from the body, and it just compares those 2 things. So it knows how we're actually moving, it compares that to what we're trying to do, and it actually sends corrective feedback back up to the cortex so we can kind of adjust the movement while it's in progress. Very interesting, because all these adjustments happen very fast so that the movement looks coordinated. So traveling on this tract here, notice this is right in the middle. So this is called the middle cerebellar peduncle. This is the one that goes through the pons. The pons is here. Okay, so traveling on that, we said that this connects the cerebellum to the cerebral cortex. This is the one that carries what I call the motor plan, right, which is just the planned movement from the motor cortex to the cerebellum, so that the cerebellum knows what we're trying to do. And then on this inferior peduncle, this is where the cerebellum receives sensory feedback. So this carries proprioception. Again, that's body awareness. To the cerebellum. And so that way the cerebellum knows how we're actually moving. And then the cerebellum just compares these 2 and it adjusts the movement, okay, and sends that feedback up to the cortex. Let's through the superior cerebellar peduncle. So we'll say this carries corrective feedback. Okay, and then the motor cortex can use that to kind of, make little adjustments to the movement and kind of fine tune it. All these different motor areas that we talked about have to work together. And if you guys want to take a look at this, it's very interesting. In chapter 17, there's actually a diagram that shows the connection between all these motor areas. So it's kind of interesting because it's, of course, very complicated. But they all help to kind of adjust our movements. Okay? And you can see that information going back up to the cortex. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle carrying the corrective feedback back up to the cortex. Okay, remember the motor cortex is up in here. Any questions on any of that? This is actually also here in, I wrote pretty much the same thing here. So it's in the PowerPoint. Okay, so can you see these peduncles? Well, notice that when you're looking at a mid-sagittal cut, and let's just use this just for a second here and just ignore this stuff. Notice you can't really see them here because the cerebellum's kind of in the way, okay? So what you want to do is take a look at this brain stem. And notice here, this is where the cerebellum would be, but it's been removed. So you can see these little connections here. So what you want to remember is that this is where there would be axons that would be kind of coming out into the cerebellum, but they're cut, okay? So this one that's sticking kind of out laterally here, you can see it kind of has this connection to the pons. That is the middle cerebellar peduncle. This one that's more superior is the superior, okay? And then this one here would be the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So you can see them on this model. You cannot see them here because the cerebellum's in the way, okay? Okay, questions? Let's talk about just the last couple areas of the brain, and if you guys come up with questions, we can go back to any of this. Okay, so this next area, notice is shown here on this diagram in purple, and it really is a bunch of different structures that are in the cerebrum. This is part of the cerebrum here. And in the diencephalon, they're all connected. So it's like different nuclei and tracts that are all interconnected. Together, they are part of what is called the limbic system. Okay, so all of this stuff shown in purple is the limbic system. This diagram will be on the test, okay, so that you can see all these structures together in the same place and know that they represent the limbic system. Limbic means border, and so this is called the limbic system because this is all on like the medial border of the cerebrum, okay, the medial border, like you would see this in a mid-sagittal cut, okay? So what do these structures do? Well, the limbic system, all of this together, is responsible for the experience of different emotions and will affect our behavior in relation to those emotions. Okay? So all different kinds of emotions, joy, pleasure, sadness, rage, fear. They're experienced in different parts of the limbic system. A couple of interesting things about the limbic system, notice that the olfactory bulbs and tracts actually are connected to the limbic system. So smell is part of this whole system of structures that will respond to different smells. So this is really more important for animals of prey and animals that are predators both, because they are able to, you know, respond to different smells. They have the fear instinct that's, you know, going to allow them to respond and, you know, run away if they feel like they're being threatened. And so because they rely more on smell for survival, that's why smell is directly connected to the rest of the limbic system. In humans, I don't think we really rely on it so much for survival. And also another interesting thing is this area right here is part of the limbic system. This is called the hippocampus. This is the most important area in the brain for storing memory. And so because of this, this is why we actually remember things better if we have some kind of an emotional response to an event or to something we're, you know, hearing. If you have, you know, more of an emotional connection to something, you'll probably remember it better, right? We all know that. I mean, you know, things that really have an impact on you are usually things that make you feel something, and you tend to remember them, as opposed to, you know, stuff that you don't really care about that much. So, and that's because it's all connected. The hippocampus is connected to the rest of these structures. So I would like you guys to be able to identify the structures of the limbic system. Some of these structures are on your list, not all of them, but some of them, like the olfactory bulbs and tracts. This gyrus here is called the cingulate gyrus. Okay, the hippocampus. So some of these are on your list, so you should be able to identify them on this diagram. Okay? Questions? Okay, and then one more part of the brain I would like to talk about, and that is something else that's in chapter 17, and it's shown here. Okay, so this is showing you a cut through the midbrain, just so you can kind of see again that we have these nuclei that travel through the brainstem. I'm not going to ask you to identify this in every cross-section, but I would like you to know about this group of nuclei for the written exam. Okay, so shown here in red, notice this is showing this whole area where we have this group of nuclei that's called the reticular formation. Okay, so this is a group of nuclei that's scattered throughout the entire brainstem. And so what's important about this is notice that the reticular formation has these connections. You can see they're showing them just with these purple lines that come up to the cortex. And so what it's trying to show you is that the reticular formation sends signals that will go to the cortex. So these connections here, as shown in the purple lines, are actually called the reticular activating system. Okay, reticular activating system. Abbreviated RAS. And so the reticular formation is just the neuron cell bodies here, the nuclei. The reticular activating system are these like ascending axons that go up to the cortex. So we'll say ascending tracks or axons going from the reticular formation to the cortex. So what do you think, based on this name, the reticular activating system, what do you think that these might do to the cortex, these neurons? We'll tell you the answer is right here in its name. They literally activate the cortex. So this is why when we are, receiving certain types of sensory information, we tend to be more alert and awake. So you can see here how they're showing sensory input coming into the reticular formation. The reticular formation receives a lot of sensory feedback from the body, but especially from the face. So this is why we feel more awake if you like splash water on your face, or you are listening to something, turn on the lights in the morning and make it brighter, you feel more awake because we get more sensory kind of information coming in that will stimulate these neurons here in the reticular formation. These in turn will send more signals to the cortex. The cortex is where we think, right? So when the cortex becomes more active, we feel more alert and awake. So this area is really responsible for levels of alertness. Okay, different levels of alertness. Okay? When we are sleepy or actually sleeping, this area is not as active. If this area is damaged, it will result in coma or unconsciousness. So very important area for helping to regulate the activity of the cortex. And again, this is in chapter 17. I think there's like maybe a couple paragraphs at the most if you want to read about it. This diagram will not be on the test. This is just something to know for the written exam. Okay, and that is it. That is the brain. It's just that easy. Nothing to it, right? So what we need to talk about still are the cranial nerves, but what I'd like to do is, instead of going through those and taking up a bunch of time, I would like to just write down what I would like you guys to know about the cranial nerves. I will do that during lab, and you can take notes on it then, okay? For now, we will take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about the spinal cord, so you guys can get started on the spinal cord, okay? Any questions on any of this before we